people's resistance to change, most often on a subconscious level, is that there's a part of them that derives a sense of safety and identity from being a part of a kind of cultural range that is disempowered and contracted and disembodied. So the sense of like, okay, I'm gonna feel my feelings and be embodied and be more creatively empowered and take responsibility for my life may register as being unsafe because uh, it's a disagreement or a betrayal of the culture in which we rely on for survival and identity and belonging.
Welcome to the Soul Awakened Leadership Podcast. Soul Awakened leaders are courageous innovators and pioneers who embody a deep knowing of our interconnectedness and operate from a mindset of co-creation in service to all of life. They surrender their existence completely to a higher organizing principle that is leading them beyond separation and competition and opens up the potential for an entirely new way of being on this planet in a time of metamorphosis. In this podcast, I share cutting-edge perspectives and invite the voices of leaders who don't create followers but inspire others to step into their true power and essence. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Rob Kancler. Rob embodies a deep passion and dedication for the inquiry of what it means to be human and how to live a full life. He guides men to expand their experience of what they thought to be possible in the bedroom by tapping into the whole range of emotions that live in our bodies. From this angle, we explore how we can overcome the deep resignation and hopelessness that is keeping so many men in our society disengaged and numb, where our natural response would be to access our sacred rage to defend what's true and beautiful in face of what is happening with our lives and the world. Before we begin, I want to announce that you can still apply for the Soul Awakened Leadership Circle group coaching program that I'm offering again. It is a curated support structure for pragmatic visionaries who are committed to deep inner work while being actively engaged in the world by bringing their gifts fully to the marketplace in service to life. Described by former participants as a deeply transformative experience and something that I haven't really been exposed to ever, this is a group of allies that comes together to uplevel each other for what's to come. If you want to find out more or apply, you can find all the details at soulawakenedleadership.com. Today I'm here with Rob Kancler, and before I introduce him, I invite us to take a moment to really consciously center and presence ourselves and to focus our attention inward, to close our eyes if that's supportive, and just to take a few breaths, really connecting with our own bodies and consciously opening ourselves to this space by letting everything that happened so far today fade away and allowing everything to fade into the background that will still happen today, so that for this next hour we can give this conversation our full attention and presence. And just continuing to breathe deeply into our belly, softening and landing here with all our being, and to connect with this space of awareness that is bigger than our bodies, bigger than our emotions, bigger than our thoughts, that contains all of them. And I invite us to feel the connection with the vast network of life that we're part of, feeling this intelligent web of life within us and around us. And continuing to breathe into this and infusing it with our life force. And if it feels right for you, I invite you to dedicate this next hour to more than just your own personal development. But if it's available to you, to dedicate it to the entire web of relations that you're part of. And to visualize that the impulses and insights that you gain from this conversation may ripple out into the field and impact the world around you and through you in beautiful ways. And as we're holding this intention in our heart, taking a few more deep breaths. And whenever you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes. Yeah, here we are. Rob, thank you so much for being here. We met a few years ago in Berlin, where we actually lived together for a while and had many, for me, thought-provoking and inspiring conversations. And I perceive you as a deeply grounded and embodied man, not just because of your background in dance and yoga, but also because you bridge your spiritual path with a deep inquiry into, yeah, very practical matters such as business, leadership, and social dynamics. You've worked as a coach, as a consultant, movement teacher, and many other roles from an interdisciplinary backgrounds. And one of the big topics that I associate with you is to support men specifically to have a better sex life. And from what I know about you, you bring a depth into this topic that makes me perceive it is almost a Trojan horse that you use to guide men deeper on their path of awakening. What I personally find so refreshing about you is that you, in a gentle but really fierce way, challenge social assumptions and unspoken cultural agreements by disrupting or at least bringing awareness to them. And in that, I perceive you as a very authentic and, yeah, not dependent person who's looking for other people's approval. And so I'm excited about this conversation and where it will take us. Welcome again, Rob.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Jonathan.
Mm,
And take in the feedback and compliments, and I can send some back your way. Yeah, I perceive you or have a story that you are a inspiration to myself and many around being yourself.
mm,
There's something about like your commitment to yourself that I personally find to be truly inspiring, especially for the parts of me who might feel like I need to be different than I am to get love or belonging or something. That I experience you as really demonstrating and embodying an example of just just be. And I feel so much beauty and connection and in so many of our interactions, and I'm honored to be here. Curious to
mm.
see what will happen in the next hour.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, that lands very warmly in my heart and shows again that oftentimes we perceive in the other qualities that we also have within ourselves, so we can be these, yeah, golden mirrors for each other. So if this was the best conversation that you had all week, what would have to happen and what would we be talking about in this next hour?
Mm, nice. Well, it seems like what people like talking about with me a lot these days is sex. That's the theme. Definitely self-chosen in many ways. This is a role that I've positioned or put myself in some ways, and it also has been a role that I've found myself in before there was any conscious effort or attempt to do so. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I can imagine that we'll play around that topic in some ways while
Mhm.
we're here.
Mhm.
Um, I do also really value the balance of having space to just kind of share the thoughts when they feel inspired, the different ideas or stories that might want to come through with the mutual discovery, like the co-creation and dialogue of this conversation. So those are two things that
Mhm.
come. It's like wanting to be in connection with you and be in a dialogue about this as we discover what to do with our time
Mhm.
here. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm not attached to it, but I can see how looking around or poking around this topic of sex and sexuality might be a fun direction.
Mhm. Great. So how would you describe the work that you're doing today and what's the path that led you there?
Hmm. Yeah, so the work that I'm doing is mostly, I could say, like the titles or subtitles that we might use is related to sex education or sexuality training, or like tantra, neo-tantra, if you will. The work that I do has been called a sexual potency incubator, which I think is an appropriate name in some ways. It seems to do that, to incubate sexual potency for people. I mostly have been working with men for the past couple years, but before that, mostly with women, and who knows what's to come. Um, yeah, so the work that I do is mostly related to supporting men to understand and live into their sexual fulfillment and satisfaction from exploration of what is essence or what is really about nature or our nature and what is culture and conditioning and basically just being indoctrinated in what I could say is the impacts of collective transgenerational trauma, basically, that we're
Mm.
inside of a situation of a tremendous amount of information, or call it distortion or compensation or adaptation that might obscure a real experience of self or a understanding of nature or of our sexual nature, as we are in a sea of impressions and suggestions about what is our nature as sexual beings. And
Mm.
what I found is that when people are not aware of this, um, it's really unusual for people to experience sexual fulfillment, that it seems like people are so commonly living inside of a like a game or a story or um, a model of sexuality that is based on things like religious indoctrination and pornography and mainstream media influences and these different kind of cultural trends, and is in many ways disconnected from real experience.
Mm.
So a big part of my work and my research, like somatic consciousness research, whatever we want to call it, is about experience. It's about
Mm.
having real experience and not anything else, which I think
Mhm.
so many people are yeah, just not having that. They're not in their body. They're not being with um, things beyond their thoughts and beliefs and ideas as the primary way that they're living or making love.
Mm.
So you
Mhm.
asked a couple other questions that maybe I could use as a springboard if you want to float them back. But like, I think you asked, what do I do and how did I get there? Was that your original
Mhm.
question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think part of how I got here is related to a knowing of some kind that's been with me throughout my life, that there's something more for us as human beings in many ways, that I have since I was really little been with, I think, unusual level of doubt and suspicion and distrust that I observed in my peers and certainly in my sister, for example, and lots of other people when I was growing up, that my level of like, I'm not convinced was yeah, was maybe unusually high. The sense of
Mm.
just being suspicious of authority and external suggestions about what is, up against this sort of knowing that there is there is something way more beautiful, even if I've never seen it. I know that. And I think a great deal of what I've been exploring in my sexual life and uh, in my interest in supporting other people is in a way orbiting around this knowing, or at least
Mm.
uh, proximal to or informed by something in me that's been saying my whole life that there's something so beautiful and worthwhile that isn't being presented to you here, and
Mm.
to hold out for that, or to sustain a pursuit or dedication or investigation of how to realize that in my life and to understand what it is and how to get there and how to reliably support other people to find the breadcrumbs there.
Mm. Mm. Beautiful. Yeah, even just from that paragraph, well, there is so much potential for this conversation because I sense that because of the wisdom and the broad interest that you have and the way that you attune to the world, wherever we start, it'll inevitably lead us to a much bigger picture. And
Yeah.
so the thing is rarely the thing. There is so much more. If we talk about sex, it's so much more than the actual sexual act. And it's in a way almost like a microcosm, as I mentioned also in a previous podcast that I did with a friend, that sex is such a microcosm that how we do sex is oftentimes how we do life. And
Yeah.
through that, I feel that it influences everything else, and everything else that we see around us influences how we relate sexually. And so I'm curious to hear a bit more why specifically working with men is such an interesting starting point for you to do
Mm,
this work, and especially also with the particular angle that you have on working with them.
mhm. Awesome. Awesome. Great points. Yeah, so I was literally just speaking with my team and some folks who are helping me with a book this morning about this exact thing that um, in a way it's like personal development and sexual development where developing ourselves sexually is benefiting us as holistic individuals and vice versa, that the way that we
Mm,
orient to what is aspirational personal development and self-realization is actually the same things or adjacent to the things that facilitate a beautiful and fulfilling and complete sexual life. That I see this has been so clearly my personal journey, that so much of my life has been um, like I could cheekily frame it as like Dick Forward's personal development, or like the sense of like my interest in becoming a better lover is actually a very central catalyst or fuel or channel for a much broader movement towards greater integration, healing, self-awareness, integrity, all kinds of
mm,
stuff. That this is this has really been my experience, that so much of my longing for sexual satisfaction and understanding how to have a harmonious relationship with a sexual partner has been the fuel for a much more inclusive and comprehensive journey of self-inquiry and learning, really.
mm,
And that's just really been my experience. And in the programs that I run, it's it's so clearly like that for so many men, that
mm,
their marriage is different, their parenting is different, their business is different, because we're really just exploring embodied consciousness from a place of like nervous system awareness and being trauma informed and all of that stuff.
mm,
Even if it's purely so that we can have as good of a sex life as we possibly can, we will accidentally along the way become better people and better men. And how
mm,
convenient, because there are so many people who are not about that. And this is a question for me as a entrepreneur or whatever, is um, there's so many people who just like want to have better sex. They're not really committed to a path of personal growth. And this is
mm,
similarly the appeal of teaching dating and seduction related stuff, or attraction, or whatever we want to call it, where um, the promise of learning how to talk to girls and getting more dates and having more sex or having better sex is something that has so much, it's so easy, it so resonates with a more mainstream audience, where people are like, "Oh, I'm in because of that outcome." And now we're having a very deep and real conversation where we're looking at the whole situation, or a lot of it, and
mm,
having a very deep conversation about personal responsibility and integrity, and um,
mm,
simply just so that we can have the conversation about sex from my perspective, and doing it right and doing it with integrity, and not giving power tools to teenagers, as a friend and mentor of mine says, that,
mm,
it's necessary to include a much deeper investigation of our intentions and a greater, even existential orientation of like, why are we here? What are we doing? What do we value?
mm,
What is the purpose
mhm,
of relating to people? What is the purpose of a partnership? And what is the purpose of your sexual life as
mhm,
as a place to orient the rest of the investigation, for example?
mm,
So
mm,
yeah, I don't remember where we started there. Maybe you can help me orient. But there's many, many directions. And I agree, the microcosm thing is so vividly what I see in myself and with a lot of people. And yeah, the Trojan horse thing that you mentioned, I think is very much the
mm,
the thing, where I feel so honored to be having these conversations of such depth and such vulnerability and intimacy with other men, and with men that are either on a path or really stepping into owning their path of how to be in integrity with what matters to them most, how to really fully live an integrated life of deep integrity, where their values kind of spread across their creative,
Mhm.
professional, sexual, relational, and spiritual life.
And what stuck with me was how you mentioned the aspect of sensuality and the simplicity of that, because many of the things that you touched upon for me very directly lead to the bigger question of what does it mean to be a human? And I feel, especially in these days, there's so much confusion because so many of the old definitions and so many of the old institutions that gave orientation and clarity on what
Hmm.
it means to be a good human are falling away. And we're tapping
Hmm.
into a big field of meaninglessness and hopelessness. And so I can relate from my own moments of darkness and despair that oftentimes one of the few things that was still active in me when nothing else seemed to be making any sense was that sensuality and feeling my body, and be it, being actively working out or feeling that there's still eros and sex drive within me. And so coming from that place, I feel it's such an
Hmm.
essential and powerful vehicle, for people to
Yes.
really
Awesome.
access that. And so many times, and I'm jumping a bit from the very personal to the very global. If we speak about regeneration or climate change or these kind of things, it's so
Yes.
abstract that for a lot
Yes.
of people, it just doesn't make any sense. And so, why would they care about climate change? Why would they care
Yes.
about regeneration?
Yes.
And my sense is if we want collectively to shift something, we need to create a world that is more beautiful and has more beauty, more sensuality for all people involved, not just the
Yes.
few who have a cosmocentric consciousness that know that it is making sense rationally to take care of the planet, but even the one that might be labeled as the 1% that are destroying the planet, but really recognizing also for the fraction of the global community that doesn't have an environmental awareness, that doesn't have an understanding for regeneration, there is
Yes.
something that connects very intimately with them if we talk about that aspect of sensuality that we in some way all can relate to, even if it might be very suppressed. But we all have that. And if we use that as a starting
Yes.
point to bring more beauty and more aliveness into our life, I feel that that can have a ripple effect that has global implications.
Huge. Beautiful. Beautiful. Love it. Yeah,
Mm.
it's this is a slightly different angle that I can respond with here, but I love your languaging. I appreciate how you frame all of this. Um, there's something that I see where it seems like there are so many people, and part of the audience that I serve is a more or less mainstream American male audience. And within that population of people, there seems to be a fair amount of a like a lack of ambition or buy-in towards personal development, that people seem to have this assumption that it's fine, like everything's okay. It's not
Mm.
like I don't need to change. I don't need to do anything different. We don't need to change as a society. Everything is going to be fine. That it seems
Mm.
like there is a lot of um, some sort of comfort or some sort of like there just isn't incentive to change, basically. There isn't incentive to change. It seems like so many people are really like maybe like stuff's kind of shitty, but like it's fine. If I
Mhm.
keep doing what I've been doing, it'll be all right. Like I don't need to do anything different besides stay in my lane for the rest of my life and I'm gonna be okay.
Mm.
And two places where that can get disrupted is when men are single because they're aware that the vision that they have for their life is not them being alone. In most cases, it's being with a woman that they love and are attracted to and have sex with, that they are with this sense of like, clearly, if I just keep doing what I've been doing, I'm not going to be in a good place because I'm single. I'm alone. I don't want that. So I think the
Mm.
premise of like, you're going to learn how to talk to women, you'll learn how to talk to girls and have more success with women is incentive for a lot of men to basically get turned on to a more holistic conversation about personal development via pickup, where I see that there's such a mixed bag and definitely a bad like public regard towards the pickup community, and I understand why people arrive there. I think it makes sense, and there's certainly
Mm,
some sketchy stuff that goes on in those conversations and communities and te like teaching environments or whatever. And it does, from what I've seen, serve a incredibly valuable function where there are so many men who are looking very deeply at things that they had previously taken for granted or not considered or thought were not important because they want sex actually, or they want a girlfriend, and they're not actually like just the premise of like, okay, if you focus on this, and this, then you will find more sexual partners is one of the only things that could incentivize a lot of these people to kind of pull their head up out of the mud and take responsibility for different parts of their life that they just assumed were fine and were a non-issue and that everything would be okay if they never looked at them, which seems like it
mm,
is the assumption of a huge amount of the population and like my father's generation and a lot of his buddies and a lot of the men that I grew up around and folks in my hometown and so many people that I see at the gym and at cafes and in community that there's not so much in this is certainly true in more like conscious communities, but I see it so prevalent in the mainstream, is that there's just no incentive. People just they're
mm,
fine. So
mm,
um, divorce rates being super high, sexless marriages being super high, people not being sexually active is super high, erection issues are super high, prostate cancer is super high, colon
mm,
cancer is super high. Like all these things are also trending. Like it's more and more every year relatively. And yeah, for whatever reason, I think some people are able to maintain the assumption that they don't need to do anything different besides just kind of coast with the programming that they received. And, we could say that everybody needs to be like a better community member or civilian or like social justice or environment, ecological justice warrior or ally or whatever. And the reality is that most people aren't like that, but there is something about like when people realize that they don't have it all under control, then it opens a kind of humility and dedication. And it's weird that pickup and sex seem to bridge that for so many men.
mm,
So many men. And what's interesting is it very quickly can switch over to be a more holistic thing once they caught the bug, that it's both the stick and the carrot, where they're like, oh, I don't want to be alone, and like, oh, I like pussy. We might as well go to that workshop or whatever. And then they're already like, wow, yeah, like I do want to take responsibility for my life and be really proud of who I am and stop kind of accepting that there are all of these little ways that I'm out of integrity with myself or in my relationships or whatever
mm,
that yeah, I've seen again and again that the light goes on.
mhm.
Um, and it is funny, like a Trojan horse that they're in the room because the promise was girls or sex or a partner or whatever, and now they're like, oh yeah, this is all very important. I'm glad I'm here.
Mhm. Mm. It's so fascinating. If I look at that movement and some of the sources that you also pointed me to, I can see such a wide range of intentions why people feel drawn to that community, as you also described. Some people come from feelings of deep inadequacy and powerlessness. And some of the community leaders in that arena seem to have tapped into deep, deep mystical experiences and deep mystical reference points that influence also their teaching. Well, they're bringing in the whole range from very basic, okay, how do you talk to women, to all the way, what does that mean with my relationship to life, to God, and all the things. So I can
Mhm.
sense the potential in that field and how charged it is because of that life force energy of Eros. And my sense is that many people who have this perspective on life that it's okay, and then that they can get by has a lot to do with the general numbness that many people experience in their bodies, in their life, where they don't even have a reference of what could be possible. And somehow, when you
Yes.
shared
Yep.
about your suspicion that there's more to life. It really resonated with me, and my life story, I feel, is very beautifully mirrored by the book that I was named after, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, about the seagull who's very different than the rest of the flock and who isn't happy with just picking food and survival, but who
Yes.
longs for the art of flight and practices despite being shunned from his tribe.
Yes.
So I feel that in order for people to really change, on one hand, it requires either a pain that is big enough and that can come through that longing, that lack of what they want to experience, or the sense of powerlessness or the inadequacy, oftentimes also through crisis and pain and sickness or a partner leaving them. But I think on the other hand, it also in some way needs, in a way, a perspective of what is possible. And I would say even a reference experience of having experience being up the mountain in order to want to do that again. So having that balance between crisis and pain and hope and longing to really set people on the path. I'm curious how you're working with that dynamic for men that come to long
Hmm.
for more sex, but then realize, oh, there's actually a deeper longing behind that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe bookmark to come back to, and then I'll go direct to your question here. But to name this one, I think that there is also often an assumption in people where they think that if they just like get their shit together in terms of just like being a responsible adult, that that will by default mean that they will have success with women and will have a beautiful sexual life. So there's a lot of people that uh, end up in my world that were like, they end up being in their late 30s or 40s or 50s and realize like, oh, I checked all the boxes of what I thought I was supposed to be doing, and I still am really alone and am
Mm.
just unsatisfied sexually and relationally. So that's also another thing that I think happens a lot where people are like, oh, I didn't develop in these ways even though I got my shit together. So that's one thing. But to bring it back to what you first asked, and we can maybe come back to the thing I just said here.
Mm.
Um, I do think that something that a lot of people would benefit from is really embracing their dissatisfaction and really taking seriously the part of them that's like, fuck this. Like, I'm not okay with this. I
Mm.
think that there's a lot of like softness and flimsiness, and I track it in an embodied way. It's like there's almost like a kind of collapse or like resignation, kind of fuzziness that I really, really value when people own, and I feel the edge in my body, this kind of power of like, no, like I'm not okay with this. Like I'm not going to stand for it. This is my life. This is my community. This is my world. I'm not going to fucking do that. And I think there's so many people who are just kind of like, ah, it's fine. It's not that bad. It's whatever. And like, yeah, like I think it's beautiful to be relaxed and to experience like a sense of faith and all as well. And I think there's something so beautiful about like the clarity that like this is not okay. I
Mm.
am not going to stand for this being my life. I will learn that. I will change that. I will take responsibility for that. And I think that this is something that I see in a lot of spiritual communities that I don't like. Sometimes it makes me feel like really riled up where I don't think it is beneficial to us as individuals or to the communities that we're a part of or to the world as a whole for a lot of people who are often, very in privileged or advantageous situations for whatever reason that are just kind of like, ah, it's fine. Like
Mm.
it's okay. And I think that when we look more broadly or globally or look through time or really feel the pain of the world, or even the pain of ourself, that it's not so easy to arrive at it's fine. So I think like I really am like a proponent of people taking very seriously what they feel and to be in a practice of experiencing the reality of the impact that the world has on them and their own life circumstances have on them and their own longings have on them, that there's so much juice and there's so much fuel in like taking very seriously what is or isn't okay and what is or isn't in integrity for us as individuals and as men. And that is the juice, that is the power
Mm.
in many cases that we can use to really move the needle and to create change. That this, even this element of like anger, rage, or outrage, or like, no, like I'm not gonna fucking let that be my life anymore. Or I'm not going to let that be the circumstance that I just step into in 2 months from now because I didn't do anything about it ahead of time. That this
Mm.
is something that I think is really, really, really important.
Mm.
Um, yeah, to really just take seriously um, the creativity that comes from anger, basically, is one simple way that I could say this, that this is encroaching on something that matters, and I
Mhm.
will not stand for it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's I think that's a really important thing that relates to embodiment, and I think that there's a the driving force or the context that allows for what I just described to happen is a body-based issue.
Mm.
That when people are when people have the capacity to be in their bodies and to be present to what is happening in their bodies, I think what I just described is just a symptom or like an incidental occurrence from embodied capacity, is one way that I could frame it, or like just simply the embodiment or being present to what is actually arising on the level of the sensations and energetic movements and emotions and inspirations and impulses that we have, is something that we are actually present to, and that we are embodying and bodifying and coordinating this into our actions ultimately, but certainly through our local somatic, psychological, neurological, visionary activities.
Mm.
It's funny how it comes back to that again and again. No matter where we look, the body
Yeah.
seems to
Mhm.
be at the center.
And I can relate personally so intimately because I can track that pattern within myself of that collapse, and the suppression of the anger. And I feel how deep it goes. It's not just the spiritual bypassing and going into the head about spiritual philosophies and non-duality where everything is fine, but actually feeling how dangerous at times it feels to feel anger in my body, and how much work it has been for me to expand my capacity to hold the intensity, to feel that
Yes.
anger and to set that
Yes.
boundary that comes from that. And I
Yes.
was very touched recently. I had a brief conversation with my dad, who shared with me for the first time really that there was a time in his life when he chose to step away from the anger for the injustice, how the money is destroying the world, and these kind of things that he had in his years when he went to university, and he felt more of that fear and allowed that fear to take more space. And I could feel
Mhm.
how it has been passed, not just directly from my dad and the behavior that I saw modeled by my parents to me, but going much deeper actually, and sensing how my grandfather, who experienced the Second World War, had that same pattern in a way, or learned that same pattern. And I somehow feel it very strongly connected
Mm.
to the Second
Mm.
World War and the sense of
Beautiful.
powerlessness, where there
Yes.
wasn't even a possibility to feel that anger, but because who do you direct that anger to? For me, it even
Yes.
went so deep that I felt it was a big betrayal to a force that I could best describe as the Divine Mother, and the sense of safety that somehow life provides, but in face of the forces of the Second World War that are so much bigger than me personally. I could feel that there was almost a rupture between that sense
Yes.
of embodiment and grounding and safety that I
Yes.
associate with the mother and with the earth, that there was a choice almost, or at least an unconscious response to disconnect from the body and not to feel the
Yeah.
anger because it wasn't safe, because there was no way to direct it towards. So it feels like such a
Yes.
monumental task to feel that in my body, and to feel how far back it goes, and that it's not just
Mm.
my personal life and my personal relationship to anger, but it's a collective field, and it's an
Yes.
ancestral trauma that we're tapping
Awesome.
into, even if we've done our own trauma work around anger, to really feel how powerful these forces are, and how, even if I'm just relating with my partner and I notice how I'm not able to express my boundary, how far back that actually goes, and how much bigger it
Mhm.
is than just this personal connection. But in that, I see also the potential that if I can resolve that in my body and if I can create more space for that anger in my body, I can also contribute to
Mhm.
shifting that collective field, that collective pattern of allowing
Yes.
more of these emotions that were stuck and frozen to become available and therefore inform our intelligence, which I think in so many ways is needed. Because if we would,
It's
and just as a
exactly.
last sense, if we would apply our intelligence to what is happening in the world, it would be a massive outcry and so much rage against fuck that. What we're doing with the world is not okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Where is that? Like
Yes. Yes.
Terence McKenna says things are getting so weird that we need to talk about how weird things are getting. Why is nobody talking about how weird things are already? And I feel a
Yeah.
lot has to do with that suppressed aliveness of the anger that we're not allowing.
Yes. And I do think that like one way that I can highlight part of what you're saying is helplessness. That I think that there's so much of this kind of resignation or collapse or disconnection from that fuel of like, fuck this, because we
Hmm.
don't know what to do. And it's just too uncomfortable or just feels like suffering to be connected to that outrage and that feeling that like I need to channel this energy somehow, but I don't know what to do. And it's too uncomfortable to be with the not knowing. So I'm just going to shut it down. That I
Hmm.
think so many people are experiencing a sense of, even on a personal level, not even on a, if you zoom out to, communities and nation states and all this kind of stuff, but just on the level of like in my own life, I'm deeply not okay with the situation and I don't know
Hmm.
what to do. So I would rather not feel how much I'm suffering because what's
Yeah.
the point? It's not, I can't
Hmm.
change anything. I'm completely disempowered, like I'm basically just inside of this hellish like post-capitalist situation where we're just going headfirst into a brick wall and there's nothing I can do about it and everything is insane. So who cares? Like almost this kind of like nihilism or this bent towards like I don't want to just be grieving and frustrated all the time. So I'm just gonna forget about my grief and my anger and
Yeah.
focus on things that are more light and easy because there is nothing I can do.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and in a certain way, maybe that's true. There is a tremendous amount of injustice that we can't do anything about, and it's important for us to, know what is ours and what isn't, and where we will be focusing our energy. But I think that the underlying piece around embodiment and developing the capacity to be present to what is actually happening in the body is something that is so important. And I think that when we don't do that, there are so many consequences, and one of them is our sexual lives. That I
Mhm.
think that the connection to our aliveness and being really embodied with also these, more um, mystical or esoteric parts of the human experience where we are resonating with transpersonal and collective charges, but just purely on the level of like individual experience, that it takes a lot to be willing to just feel your feelings and to befriend your feelings and to just be present to sensations in the body as they are is something that most people do not have. And again, it's like if I am purely just endeavoring to support somebody and having the best sexual life that they can, we end up looking at this because you got
Mm.
to. We cannot not be embodied and be in this exploration of human sexual potential. We can't. It's not possible. You cannot be perpetuating a state of disembodiment while investigating the potential of sexual experience.
Mm.
And if you are exploring being embodied, you will encounter what do we do with anger and rage and grief, sadness, like all of these flavors of stuff that are so intense and so difficult that people just they resign, they give up, they collapse, they dissociate, they stop feeling it because it's too much. And it is too
Mm.
much. It is too
Mhm.
much. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that this has a lot to do with also the breakdown of uh, how we relate to things like grief and the importance of grief rituals through different cultures through time and how much we don't have that or a replacement for that and how that extends into the absence of ritual and community in so many other arenas of life and how that impacts embodiment because it is embodiment like when I use this word, sometimes it's helpful to clarify that embodiment is not just this,
Mm,
it's all of it. It's like being integrated into the reality of this physical plane.
mhm,
And part of that is community, and part of that is nature, and part of that is these kind of more geopolitical spheres of influence and activity as well.
mhm.
And being embodied on all of those layers is a profound exploration.
Yeah. Yeah, and you brought in something that is already part of an answer, I believe, to a question that I was about to ask next, and especially what to do with this overwhelming helplessness and the sense of powerlessness and the reluctance towards life and the collapse that comes from that. And
Mhm.
what you tapped into is to expand the body to feel the intensity of that. Because with many traumatic emotions that are stored in the body, my understanding is that they are caused because we were confronted with something that was too much for too long while we were alone. And so the way
Yes.
to heal that is to create more space and to expand the space that holds the intensity of that was too much for our body and connect our nervous systems in a way. And ritual, in my experience, does that. That we create a collective nervous system that is bigger than our individual nervous system and therefore can hold more of the intensity of what is moving through us individually. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm curious if there's anything else that you see as a path to move from dissociation more to association, from disembodiment and numbness more to embodiment, in addition to connecting with others in this way to allow more space for these emotions to be felt.
Great question. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to kind of speak to the circumstance more, if that would be helpful for some people to hear, is that what ends up happening in not all cases, but in some, a really common thing that I see and that I can certainly identify in my history is that we suppress and we suppress and we suppress until there's a big eruption,
Mm,
and uh, then we suppress again and we suppress again. And there's often these kind of cycles of denial and overwhelm and the sense of like, okay, I don't feel the existential angst and fear and concern and terror that I have, or the grief and pain, or the outrage and frustration and yeah, all these different kinds of upset until I do, and then it's full on, and I'm immersed in this chaotic emotional experience. And then that will settle, or people will feel shame or overwhelm or fear about the eruption itself. And there's just a lot of cycling that goes
mm,
on. And I think that something that can also happen is when people are learning more about somatics or embodiment or trauma awareness or whatever, nervous system awareness, that they try to feel it all on their own. And that's not possible or healthy or useful in most cases. And the trauma healing people use the word titration, which I think is a really good word. And this gets into something that takes more skill and nuance. But just to kind of speak to it in short, it's like we have capacity, like we have limitations to our capacity. There are certain things that are beyond our window of tolerance or our range of what we can be present to. And a lot of that has to do with duration, for example. So if we
mm,
are feeling really intense fear or grief or anger, that it's easy to overwhelm ourselves by, or I could say that it's easy in a way to, or there's a pathway where we can explore titration. And what I mean by that is, how can I include things that are resourceful for my nervous system and that support a sense of regulation and being connected to like the goodness of life and the things that make me feel safe and support my body and being regulated while I'm exploring being present to these things that are really big, or these things that I have never really investigated successfully in the past, that I haven't been able to share with other people or feel in myself or reveal in community or in relationship, that in my experience, there's something really important about learning how these nervous systems work so that we can be exploring consciousness and relationality in a way that is actually informed by the reality of being in these particular kinds of biological systems. That the sense of like, yeah, there are limitations and preferences to these particular kinds of biologies. And yeah, there's so much value in learning about our limitations and our needs and regulation and co-regulation and the the way to resource a nervous system so that we are capable of experiencing things that are outside of our previous like zone of okayness. And
Mm.
what one thing that I'm trying to think of who I got this quote from. Maybe it'll land for me in a second, but the alternative to this is to organize your life in a way where you never have to feel things that you don't know how to feel, which is impossible, first of all.
Mm.
And it requires codependent entanglement for you to find a bunch of other people to subconsciously agree that we're all going to behave in a way where we will not touch something in one another so that we don't have to feel something that we don't know how to feel. And it's not super fun. From my
Mm.
experience, I find that being in those kinds of dynamics or relationships is just, it's not what I'm here for. I don't like it. I have very little patience and tolerance for that kind of thing. It's just not, yeah, I don't want that. And I don't think many people do when they are aware that there's an alternative that is also safe. And
Mm.
maybe this is useful, and I think this is, depending on your audience, pretty common, is that our patterning and our adaptations and all this stuff that we learn to do that we could say is perpetuating our suffering in part is something that we learned to do because it served a purpose, that we or our ancestors picked this up because it helped us survive in
Mhm.
a less than ideal situation. And respect. Like that's beautiful that we are that there that intelligence is here, that we were able to um, find ways of adapting to a really shitty situation for, in many cases, many generations or many hundreds or thousands of years. That uh, this has not been a good thing. It's not been a good situation for embodied, interconnected, healthy living and
Mm.
an ecological embodiment as well. So it does seem like um, when there are new resources and opportunities available, that people or these systems that we could call people are very inclined towards letting things go and moving into a new paradigm when they know that the alternative is safe.
Mm.
So this, brings up many things. Like one of them is the individual kind of body-based consideration. The other is culture, where people need to feel like they belong to a culture. In almost all cases, folks need a sense of kind of belonging and solidarity and association and being like, okay, these are my people. There are other people that live this way, that think this way, that act this way, and they're all okay. And I'm a part of that group and I'm fine. That I think a lot of people, and this plays into Gay and Katie Hendricks' frame around the upper limits problem, which I think is super interesting and just an incredible way of describing something that I see everywhere. Is that I think a part of people's resistance to change, most often on a subconscious level, is that there's a part of them that derives a sense of safety and identity from being a part of a kind of cultural range that is disempowered and contracted and disembodied. So the sense of like, okay, I'm gonna feel my feelings and be embodied and be more creatively empowered and take responsibility for my life may register as being unsafe because uh, it's a disagreement or a betrayal of the culture in which we rely on for survival and identity and belonging. And this
Mm.
is crazy. Like it's so wild to realize that there are so many factors and forces that are influencing us. And when we don't have the capacity to be present, we are in so many ways just subject to this stuff that's below the surface that keeps us running these patterns, that keeps
Mm.
us identified with these different adaptations and patterns of how consciousness can play so that our system feels safe. And from what I've seen, the capacity to be present to sensations and to stay present in the body has so much to do with how we can disentangle from all of these different kind of layers of identity formation that impact our ability to expand and be creative and to be a force for what is seeking to come through us rather than just kind of being yanked around by how we're entangled in all of these other things that relate to survival.
Mm.
And I think so many people don't realize like they just feel so bad and they feel trapped inside of their little frame and experience. And it's just wild how much the body seems to affect it. And I am really curious on a level of like a facilitator and someone who is having an opportunity to communicate with folks, how to meet people at different stages of development and awakening and resourcefulness and awareness to support their systems and to support them as human beings to be more resourced, essentially, to be able to find more opportunities for conscious and expanded and life-giving embodiment and patterning and behavior and self-realization, essentially, to transcend all of this stuff that us and our ancestors have been doing to get along in this very bizarre situation for the past generations and millennia.
Mm.
Which brings up a conversation of like, where did it all come from? Like, how did everything get so fucked up? But yeah, maybe we don't go there right now. Curious how
Mm.
this is landing for you.
Yeah, my tendency would be actually to go into the other direction of the historical strand, no, and to look where is it taking us, because what you're describing to me is very clearly this path of finding a solution in the body to dissociate as a response to inadequate environmental circumstances that were actually not safe, but then we're carrying on that solution of disassociating and disembodying into an environment where it is potentially safe to be in our bodies.
Yeah.
Because we've changed the
Yes.
environment, but we take the same pattern with us, and then it becomes a problem. So what was a
Yeah.
solution becomes the problem in the new environment and creates all kinds of side effects. It creates
Yeah.
the porn pandemia, it creates drug abuse, all kinds of things that in a way speak to the disembodiment that we feel in our
Yes.
systems and that prevent
Yes.
us from taking the next step on our evolutionary ladder, which requires more of
Awesome.
the intelligence in our bodies.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. It's such an interesting thing of like, is it the case? And if it is and how it is, what to do when people are operating on outdated information and they're not getting a renewed imprint of reality?
Mhm.
But this is like it's a real bitch of a thing for facilitators and coaches and even just like in my seeking to understand like
Mhm.
why does it be like that?
Mhm.
That there is this sense of like sometimes, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that we're moving too fast. I think that
Mhm.
that's a thing where like we're not even on the ground enough to get information about reality
Yeah.
so that it could somehow update what we're running, the different
Mhm.
kind of software, let's say, or operating system that we're running that we're not even on the ground. We're just kind of running through the room without our feet on the ground. So we're not getting information about like, oh, it is actually different than I thought it was.
And I think a lot of that is because we're caught in that problem solution trance. That
Yes.
it is
Well, it's
so
fear.
uncomfortable
Exactly.
to
We're
be with
unsafe.
what is that we're rather doing something that is completely pointless, but gives us the sense of control because at least we're doing something.
For
But in
sure.
a way, it's aggravating the problem and therefore getting us further away from actually being with what is, which is also why I often say to my coaching clients, I'm not here to solve your problem. I'm also not here to make what is go away. I'm here to support you to create more capacity to be with what is.
Yes.
And through that slowing down, arriving with what is and finding the acceptance of, this is what is right now. My
Yeah.
experience often after that comes a certain sense of grief. of like, wow, coming to terms with what is causes a level of grief. But if we dare to feel that grief, sometimes then comes the anger and comes into an activation. But oftentimes it's also a sense of release and a relaxation of like, wow, I don't have to do anything all the time. I can also just be, and coming from more from a doing and stress and burnout into a state of being and being okay with what is.
Hmm.
And one of the thoughts that I just had is in relation to sex. If we have a deep experience with someone where we feel that sense of safety in our bodies and have a sense of union, connection, and maybe even a mystical experience through our sexual experience, how that can inform then the rest of our lives. And obviously, it's a both and goes both ways, that we need to find that
Yes.
safety in our bodies to have these sexual experiences. But the other way around, if we
Yes.
inquire more into the mystical aspect of where human evolution is going, my sense is that in these sexual spaces, we can tap into experiences that point us towards something that is way beyond our current state of consciousness, way beyond our current human experience, that can, in a way, point us towards the mountain of what's ahead. And I'm curious to spend
Hmm.
the last moments of our session exploring a bit and hearing a bit from your experiences of what is possible as a human being if we tap into that on one hand individually, but also I'm curious, what is your sense collectively? Where could this journey lead us if we imagine a deeper embodied society and experiences like that in mystical sexual union that inform us of who we actually are?
Mm. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Fun to be here with you. I noticed that sometimes when I'm on podcasts and things, I end up talking really fast about going slow. So
Hmm.
there's something funny about
I
that.
just noted that in myself as well. There's so much excitement around these topics,
Totally.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
super
no, it's
energizing.
great.
I get it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, I can just say on a personal level, my first so many of my first experiences of like profound transcendence and kind of like exiting the matrix of all of this kind of crap was through the context of sexual experiences
Mm,
and psychedelics when I was much younger, but for sure, so many life-changing, formative, consequential experiences of self and of spirit or of the mystical or the mystery happened in sex. I think this is
mm,
normal for people to have transcendent experiences in the bedroom before they have access to transcendent experiences while they're walking around or looking at the sky or contemplating like geopolitical realities or whatever that somehow it does seem, and maybe this comes back to what you said before about like how there is just so much more energy and aliveness and incentive to like pay attention and like be in the experience,
mm,
that it maybe opens those channels or allows us to like stay focused and present enough and involved enough to pop through or to like move through those kind of limitations on experience basically.
mm,
So um, part of this is me just speculating, but what I can say is that, I have had many formative experiences years ago in some cases where I had a transcendental arriving to a understanding or a knowing, an awareness of what was not actually myself that I had been identified with. It was almost like I ascended or whatever, to use a silly word, or like descended or disconnected from the trappings of the illusion of my misunderstanding of who and what I am, where there was this sense of like a lucidity and an awareness and a somatic detail around all of these expressions of mind and emotion and embodiment that I had familiarity and habit with and had maybe assumed were me that suddenly certainly were not me anymore. And I think reconciling that is a journey. Like, what do I do now that I'm aware that all these things that have been like running the show are just kind of irrelevant and are more or less meaningless and are just a response inside of a physiology that doesn't really matter. That there's something profound about that disillusionment experience or that
Mm.
deconstruction. That's its own journey of forming identity and orientation post awakening. Um, Yeah, and to maybe swing that around to your original question of like, what do I think is in store for people after these kinds of disillusionment experiences or touching something that is not inside of the kind of matrix of our cultural conditioned experiences or concept of self or self-realization, whatever we want to call it. Um, I think one thing that's in store that is appealing is more beauty,
Mm.
like the exquisiteness of life to be embodied is a categorically different thing than otherwise. That I can
Mhm.
say that even just a couple years ago after I spent, a full decade exploring tantra and shamanism and all kinds of stuff, that there was this sense of like there are tiers and tiers and paradigms of deeper, more exquisite, rapturous, ecstatic experience.
Mm.
So I think the promise of transcendence resulting in beauty and not like a hedonistic kind, but like an exalted devotional experience of beauty is in and of itself, I think worthwhile if you're going to be here for a while. That's good
Mhm.
shit. The
Mm.
quality of experience and love flow and just wondrousness of our sensorial experiences and our relationality and our creativity and our experience of expressing our own essence is just so fucking awesome that I think
Mm.
that in and of itself is potentially worth the endeavor of transcendence or whatever. And there's a tangent here that I could take that speaks to like appetite, appetite for truth or transcendence, and
Mm.
potentially the variation of how some humans seem to not really care. Like they're not bent that way. Like they're not super interested or don't seem to be demonstrating a real interest in knowing self or knowing reality, that they just kind of take they just take the pill, or they take the inheritance and they just don't question it, and they pass it along to the next generation and die. That there's a
Mm.
lot of people that seem like they're not oriented that way. And I don't know. I have different theories about this that relate to like spiritual appetite, and also relate to culture or exposure or resource, and these things that we're talking about are like, do what happens when people that are more um, along for the ride rather than pioneering a path or thought leaders or whatever we want to call it. Um, yeah, that if a lot of those people may find a path just by proxy to a culture that is more resourced. So that's interesting. Like if a lot of these people who get called like sheep or NPCs or something like that, or just uh, some segment of the human population that ended up in a kind of culture that didn't handle them well.
Mm.
So, there are many different ways that I can kind of, I don't know, pontificate about this particular thing. It's not super juicy for me to go further into
Mhm.
that, but Yeah, I don't know. Like, there's a part of me that is pretty aware of and present to the real liability of the state of the world, like the real risk and like real danger of uh,
Hmm.
the situation that we're in
Hmm.
when we look at like systemic ecological, political, and economic collapse. There's definitely a good case that like we might all die. This whole entire show might end, all of it. And it could happen tomorrow, and it could happen in 20 years, or it might not happen at all. But it does for myself and, so many people that have taken a real look into that direction. We're in a dangerous moment in the evolution of consciousness as it pertains to the real impacts that what we've been doing and what we're doing now could have on what is literally required for us to not die.
Mm.
So there's something there that I wonder about, and um, I have some concern that people kind of hinge their own investigation of personal integrity and life purpose on whether or not we are experiencing systemic global collapse. That there's something for me that I think is um, I think an investigation of personal integrity is somehow independent from whether or not we're all gonna die.
Mm.
That we still got to be here while we're here. And even if we all are like barreling headfirst towards extinction, um, it seems like this investigation of personal integrity and the embodiment of our essential nature and the embodiment of our highest values is the most worthwhile thing to be doing. And seems like when people are not
Mm.
up to that, it is because of trauma in most
Mhm.
cases, and maybe not
Mhm.
personal trauma, but nevertheless a part of this kind of legacy of our collective transgenerational um, glitch or compensation or adaptation where we experience or perceive individuality or disconnection or any sort of
Mm.
motives towards exploitation and greed or whatever frames of it. So yeah, this lines me up to like good and evil kinds of stuff, which I think is like a bit interesting is like, do I believe that there's like inherent good or like there's inherent evil or like, what are really the root forces here? Is it that
Mm.
there is this inherent goodness and righteousness or divinity that is somehow just overshadowed or disabled by dysfunction or anti-nature or trauma or evil or whatever. And um I think I'll pause before going further into that because that's a whole can of worms and maybe we are at time here. But that
Mm.
really is an interesting thing to look into of like, yeah,
Yeah.
like what is the nature of reality and of consciousness and what is actually occurring here and how does that relate to this great information about nervous system awareness and being trauma informed and what more and more people seeing about like embodied empathy and embodiment practices, changing psychological themes related to like ecological responsibility and stewardship and all this kind of stuff is suggestive of certain kinds of patterns or deeper influences and forces in a way that I think is super compelling and spiritually, philosophically, uh, um, yeah, compelling. So
Mhm. Yeah.
cool.
And I feel that we're at a fascinating point in this human experiment, on this exploration of what is consciousness and what is the nature of reality. Because in my perception, there is some sort of a convergence happening, that a lot of different factors are coming together in these exponential curves. in terms of technology, in terms of global crises, but also in terms of explorations of consciousness and these kind of things. So
Hmm. Hmm.
one possibility, yes, there's a convergence towards collapse and destruction and the extinction of humanity on this planet. But I'm curious also for the other possibility. If we tune in the possibility of this being a turning point where the outside circumstances, in a way, force us towards something that you could label as a collective awakening, that we're being forced out of our reluctance, of our laziness, of our comfort, of our collapse, and forced into that activation of that anger of shifting the trajectory that with which we're heading towards the abyss. And so if you allow yourself to tap into that potential of what life beyond that point omega could look like if we're actually making it, what would your version of paradise, of heaven on earth look like if all your values and wishes come true, and yeah, we would live
Hmm.
in a new civilization beyond that?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. It's a beautiful question. Shall we go into another round of investigating your beautiful question, or do we want to wrap up here?
I'd be super happy to use that as our landing strip for the conversation if you're open to answer that question.
Yeah, cool.
Mm.
There are many people who I would say have thought about this stuff a lot more than I do, that I'm standing on their shoulders in a way to answer your question. I do have a background in ecological design and permaculture, and have spent a fair amount of time and energy researching. Uh, I think basically just following my desire to understand the world in which I live. And yeah, I mean, I could answer your question from many different angles. I think one of them is from the lens of permaculture, which is just in short, basically like a design process or a way of approaching resource management and the design of how we manage resources in a way that is aligned with how nature actually works and what human nature actually is about. So I
Mm.
think there's a lot of really beautiful frameworks and ways of seeing things in the permaculture community that just don't relate to like homestead design or like farms or whatever, but is really like looking at like, okay, we are in a place that works in a way that's like relatively understandable. Like we know stuff about like physics and chemistry and biology and ecology, and we know stuff about like human nature and like anthropology, sociology, psychology, etc. And we can take that information uh, to design things that actually make sense for the context that we are in at various scales. And I think um, there's a lot of not that, and there's a lot of like misunderstanding or avoidance of externalities and consequences of what we're doing politically and economically. And there's a
Mm.
lot of very simply like privatizing gains and inevitably putting the consequence of a lot of what we're doing politically and economically, or what different organizations are doing, uh, on the collective, where they are not responsible for the consequences of their actions, but everybody is responsible, or everybody is um, faced with the reality of those actions and their consequences.
Mm.
So there are many things that relate to just like systems of accountability, where the actors in systems, regardless of what scale, are responsible for the impacts of what they are doing. That I think that there's something just like on the level of like policy and governance and economic activities and corporations and businesses, where we kind of would by necessity have to have a different relationship with accountability, a different
Mm.
relationship with like who is responsible for what happens on this planet. Is it the people who are making the things happen? Because it seems like that, like until that's there and there isn't kind of perverse incentives with things like the military industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industry and insurance and all this stuff that's really obviously fucked up in the United States, and lobbying and all this other stuff, that like until all of that is sorted out, I don't know how we would end up in a situation where we're not just continuing to harm ourselves. basically. Like if we think about humans as like a individual or as a we body being, like we're so clearly harming ourselves. Like there's almost this like dissociative kind of schizophrenic idea that like I'm benefiting me, but who cares if I'm hurting you or them, is like that's not
Mhm.
reality. So I would say that there seems to be a uh, like inherent link between unity consciousness and like an understanding of self that is far expanded beyond the individual, and potentially like contracted fear-based values related to a conception of self that is based on an individual, to understanding the reality that like there's only one of us here and this is all me, and when I'm harming you, I'm harming myself, and if I'm taking advantage of you, then I'm exploiting myself, and if I'm harming a forest, I'm harming myself, or I'm harming myself
Mhm.
in the future, and all this stuff that it seems like people are so disconnected from the reality of what we are doing, even to ourselves in the future, never mind other people and different kinds of layers of consideration that so many people have not experienced because of, we can say like things like privilege and patriarchy, but I think what it boils down to is embodiment, disembodiment, that when people are in their bodies, it seems to kind of correlate to stewardship and empathy and consideration
Mhm.
of life. So it's kind of jamming here a little bit, but I think part of the answer to your question relates to unity consciousness and embodiment, and like a
Mhm.
stewardship of the material reality and commons, rather than creating or allowing the continuation of perverse incentives and all of these different layers of systems in our society to continue to degrade the foundation of our life and the resources that we need to live and be together. And
Mhm.
this is spread all around, from education to medicine to the concepts of self that are being perpetuated by religion. I had a really weird experience going to church the last time I was in Florida with the promotion of this idea that like we're inherently evil, and that like human beings are bad, and like thus we must be atoned for our sins. Like there's a lot of stuff that I think is really uh it's all around on so many different layers that is um necessarily going to need to change for us to uh enter the Garden of Eden, as they say. And
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't have any like idea or certainty that that's going to happen or the direction that we're headed, but it seems to me like that is what that is. And there's something just tricky about thinking through the different pathways between where we are now and where that could be put into place, considering the powers that be and the momentum of these different kind of systems and paradigms and protocols and stuff that
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. I could
Mhm.
continue. I'm curious how this lands
Mhm.
for you and how you want to end the call today, but there's a lot
Yeah.
of different directions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much that we could continue to explore, and every single aspect of our conversation has so many more rabbit holes to go deeper in,
Hmm.
and I'm sure we will at some point. But what you just shared for me brings up the quote from William Gibson, who says, the future is already here, it's just not equally distributed. That there are certain pockets where that is already the
Hmm.
reality, and it's up to us to distribute that more equally. One of the things that is for me very clear, and you mentioned that as well, is that whatever the world would look like if we were living from this place, it wouldn't be so much focused on progress and getting away from where we are. For me, it would be much more about enjoying where we are, and instead of increasing the material growth, looking at how can we create more beauty, how can we create more sensuality, and in this sense, knowing that when I'm harming you, I'm harming myself. Also knowing that if I'm creating a beautiful, a pleasurable experience for you, then I'm also creating that for myself. And I think that brings us back to sex, where for me, some of the deepest, most joyful experiences were when I saw the other person and my partner having pleasure, an experience of pleasure in that interaction, that gave me
Yeah.
so much pleasure as well. And I feel if we
Yes.
take that
Awesome.
experience as a reference to, wow, this is how we could live every day, I think the world would be an amazing place. And taking the pleasure
Hmm.
from the pleasure in someone else as our path towards a more beautiful future.
Yes. Awesome.
Mm.
Well said.
Cool.
I think this does seem to be such a profoundly consequential thing for men at least, but maybe for people in general, is that there's something about our providership or our desire to be of service and to serve women
Mm.
in this case that I think is such a beautiful part of the human experience and a beautiful part of men and maleness and masculinity is this providership. And there's something about like the pure experience of serving a woman or meeting a woman or accompanying a woman in her bliss or joy or orgasm that is and this is a big kind of part of the work is like when we're not in performance and we're not kind of in a extractive or transactional way of relating to this thing that I'm describing around providership
Mm.
and the affect that we can have on women, but there is a sense of like this is me, like this is really me being the
Mm.
most authentic version of myself I've ever experienced. And
Mm.
this is how it is impacting this other woman or this other person, that there's something so profound and so healing about how that can bridge us to our goodness and our innocence and the reality of our beauty as beings and
Mm.
as men by being in the incredible vulnerability and realness of those kinds of expanded sexual states and the feedback of how beautiful and important it is for us to be affirmed in who we are by the impact that we have on a woman is something that seems to have far-reaching consequences as we form an identity or iterate on an identity related to why we're here and what matters and what we can be doing when we know of our goodness and innocence and nature as beings of service and contribution that opens people's hearts so deeply. It
Mm.
contextualizes the rest of the game so much.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you're bringing in the concept of the game, also in that sexual realm, shifting from the finite game of quickly getting my needs met and then ejaculating for it to be over and having that goal orientation, also seeing life more from this infinite game perspective, of playing the game in order to continue playing because it's so joyful in and of itself. And I think so many people are relating to life in a way of moving towards a goal, moving towards the next thing so that they get away from what is as a symptom of the disembodiment.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'm not intending to open up that rabbit hole now because I know that there's so much more that we could say to that.
Absolutely.
But I'm
Beautiful.
I'm super curious to hear, and also especially for our audience to hear what you're currently working on, how people can connect with you, and we'll link that in the show notes as well. But if you want to briefly
Awesome.
bring that into the space.
Cool. Yeah, so if people just type in my name, my last name is Kancler, Kancler. You can find me on all the social platforms like that. And if you go to hdbedroom.com or hdbdrm.com or just I hate not having great sex all the time.com, you will find me and my work. And if you have any questions or want to get in touch, reach out. And yeah, would be happy to connect. And maybe I'll see you again on Jonathan's podcast in the future.
Amazing. Rob, thank you so much. I feel deeply inspired and energized from this conversation. I'm leaving with more aliveness than I had before, and that's always a good sign for me. So thank you so much for sharing this space and yeah, nerding out on these ideas around consciousness, sexuality, and what it means to be human at this time.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for tuning in to the Soul Awakened Leadership Podcast. You will find all the links and information on today's guest in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend who might benefit from the insights. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment or review on Spotify or any of the platforms. If you would like to find out more about my work or connect, you can visit jonathanclode.com. That is JonathanKlod.com. Or find me at Jonathan Claude on Instagram